He will explain today how small businesses may obtain income tax deductions normally taken by big businesses and super rich. He believes what's good for General Motors is good for the country. His philosophy of life comes from New Testament's 1 Corinthians 7:23. It says, "You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men." So please help me in welcoming probably one of the most successful financial planners in tax-qualified systems today, a name familiar to some of you, a business associate and a very close, dear friend of mine, Mr. Don Fletcher.
How many of you had a serious amount of money left over after last year that you didn't know what to do with? Anybody have that problem? Okay, well, it looks like we all made it to the right room. Because we're going to show, let's see, I guess I need this. Thank you. We're going to show why we have that problem. It's really, I suppose, partly your fault, but it's not all your fault. I want to show you something that's been going on in the country for a while. From 1913 on, and we're going to start with 1913 for a very interesting reason. 1913, okay, if you had a house in 1913, let's say you had a house here. This is the year. All right, I'm going to even try another marker here, see if we can get a darker marker. The average house in the United States sold for about $1,000. Okay, so about $1,000. Yeah, that's a little better, isn't it? Okay, and if you had a loaf of bread, if you bought a loaf of bread back in 1913, it cost a penny. And if you're into Mother Goose and all the rhymes, remember 1 penny, 2 penny, hot cross buns, all that stuff. Okay, you have to excuse me. I'm a grandfather, so I get into this. All right, but it's fun to see how things change here, because we're going to show you that there's a pattern. If we go to school, we get in history what's called existentialism, and I don't know if you know what existentialism means, but it means that there isn't any reason for anything; it just exists. If you really believe that, you can become a teacher. All right, we're going to show you that things don't just exist; that they are caused. And as the saying goes, yes, Virginia, there is a plan. Okay, and you're going to be amazed at this plan, I think, when you see it, because it's affecting all of us, and yet we don't realize what it is. It's sort of like we're in a riptide. We swim in, and then every Friday we swim back out. You know, the paycheck comes in, we lose it all again, and we just live paycheck to paycheck. And the other 6 days of the week we're trying to swim in, and payday we swim back out. Okay. All right. Now what we have here is a dollar. Then back in 1913 was worth $1. And income tax in 1913. Does anybody happen to know right offhand what the income tax was in 1913? Zero. Right. Isn't that interesting? There was no income tax, was there? All right. Now, we're starting with 1913 because we're going to again and again and again come back to this, because we're going to demonstrate, I think before the meeting is over here, that the United States was a different country after 1913. It had different management, it had different goals, it had a different operation. We are actually witnessing the advent of two Americas, if you will. All right? And there are two Americas existing right now, side by side. Now, you may sound like, well, which way is out? Okay. I'm sure you haven't heard anything like this. Okay, but this is actually happening. And give me just a moment to demonstrate this. But there's two things going on here that we don't understand. And when we understand it, then it makes sense, and you can cope, and you can make all the money you want to make, and you don't have to lose any in taxes and stuff like that if you don't want to. Now, if you want to pay tax, that's fine. All right. In 1913, we had an organization start in our country called a central bank. We're going to be going into a central bank and what a central bank is, because this is not taught in history. We're taught in history existentialism. The banks just come and go. There's no reason. Well, all right. Nothing that we're going to be learning today did I learn in school. Okay. This is interesting stuff. It's all in the School of Hard Knocks afterwards that we learned this. All right. The boys in the bank, the central bank, started printing money at a rate of 7.12%. Okay, 7.12% is what normally is known as the rule of 7, because if you print money at a rate of 7.12% and it's compound interest, every 10 years the money supply doubles. All right. Now the problem with that is that the base of the wealth doesn't double. So we're talking about the money supply doubles in relationship to the amounts of goods and services available, if you will. All right, in other words, there's twice as much money to buy the same commodities. All right, this is referred to as M1, M2, M1, M2, so forth and so on. We want the M numbers up here, okay, because we're going to talk about this, because these guys all baffle you with all these M numbers, all right? Now, money is printed here, okay, so that means that here's the year over here, okay, and every 10 years, this money doubles. Okay. Now, you may say, well, so what? Well, we have just described inflation. Okay? Because by 1923, the money supply in the United States had doubled. There was twice as much money in 1923 as there was in 1913, but there wasn't any more base to it. In other words, it was like just adding water to the soup. Pretty soon the soup doesn't taste quite the same, does it? All right? So now, what do you suppose, having never maybe been to Stanford or anything like this, okay, what do you suppose happened to prices? Okay, but you're familiar with Stanford, it's the school up the coast. They used to call the football team the Big Red Machine. Of course, now that's what we call the faculty. Okay, now, so what happens here, you see, is that if you had gone to a business school up there, okay, they would teach you what inflation is. By the time you get out, it takes you about 2 hours to describe inflation. Okay, and when you get through, you realize the guy doesn't really know what it is. Okay, all right, what causes inflation is an increase in the supply of money. And you can extend that to credit, if you will. Okay, to a certain extent, credit can be money, but and I'm getting this right out of Webster's Ninth Collegiate Dictionary. This is not like some esoteric tome that I'm reading. This is the English definition of inflation. It's an increase in the supply of money. Okay. All right. So if there's twice as much money in existence, what do you suppose would happen to the price of the house? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Doubles. Well, you guys aren't very sophisticated. That's right. It doubles. You see. It doubles, okay? It would take 4 years of higher education to confuse that. Okay? All right? Okay? It's not easy to confuse this. It takes quite some time. Okay? And you get degrees in it. All right? Now, what do you suppose would happen to the loaf of bread? 2 cents. Okay, you were moving along here. This is great. Sharp crowd, okay? I take back everything I heard about LA. Okay, now. All right, now. All right, dollars. Okay, what was the dollar worth? Right. See? Isn't this fun? See? Oh, boy. Now, there was an income tax because the law said in the 16th Amendment, we're going to get into the 16th Amendment because the 16th Amendment never passed. The 16th Amendment was only ratified by 4 states. It wasn't ratified by 2/3 of the states, which required for an amendment, okay? There are some books on the subject, which we'll get to later on. We're going to talk about books later on because you're going to hear some pretty bizarre stuff from me, and I would just want to be able to document it, okay? We were going to now steal from the rich and give to the poor. Is this a good deal or what? That means for you to collect something, you didn't have to do anything. Is this great? You see how that works? See? And somebody who does produce something now is now stolen from. I mean, hey, this is a great system, isn't it? And they called it, I think there was a fellow by the name of Karl Marx. He was a show business guy that they put on the name of a book years ago. And 20 years after the book was written, his name was added to it to distract from who really wrote the book. We'll get into that in history. He said that this garbage, or whatever you want to call it, is that this is called from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Isn't that interesting? So if you have an ability to pay, you pay. And if you have a need, you receive. Is this great? This has built the tremendous system that we see in Russia today. After 80 years, they cannot produce a paperclip. Okay? Why? Because, let's just take for an example, okay, you get a plot of land over there, and you go out and you say, well, this is exciting, and they give you a tractor and all this because it's a state farm, isn't it? Yeah, no pun on the insurance company. Okay, what happens here is that so you go out every morning at 5 o'clock and you farm this land, okay? And boy, you have a great harvest. Well, meanwhile, this dodo that lives next to you sleeps till noon every day. Well, you know, he's not too excited about it. Now, what happens at harvest time? You take your wheat into the government town, and the government gives you back equal amounts. I mean, because you're equal now, right? Isn't that interesting? So you make an interesting observation that on the day of harvest, he gets as much as you get. Get it? So this is equality. Why, isn't this nice? Okay, the only question I have is, what time do you get up next year? Yeah. See, who produces the wheat? Nobody. Isn't that interesting? We have now described socialism. That takes about 3 years in the government school. Okay, now, so what are we learning here? Okay, we're learning that the information we have is pretty much bunco, isn't it? We don't know why we're broke. We don't know what's wrong with the country. We don't know why we can't keep what we earn. We don't know all these things, you see. And after I submit, after the seminar today, we will. You may be mad, but you'll know it. Okay. Okay, now, and this is called, by the way, this is called M1, because that was the original supply of money. Okay. That's our first problem, is that the board doesn't erase. Okay. So we'll just use different colors as we go over it again and again, okay? All right, now, all right, this is known as M2. Why is this known as M2? Because there's twice as much money. It's money too, I guess. You know, I took years of this economic stuff, and if you ever wrote anything intelligent on a test, of course, you'd flunk the test, so you didn't put anything down that made any sense. Okay, that's economics, okay? Now, all right, we're in for another big surprise. What do you suppose happened in 1933? Moving right along, we now find that the boys keep printing the money here, and there may be some girls involved, I'm not sure. All right, and we have $4,000 for a house. We have 4 cents for a loaf of bread. We have 25 cents for worth of $1. We have a 1% income tax. Now, isn't that interesting? If you worked and worked and worked and you finally doubled your income, so you could stay even where you were the last 10 years, your taxes doubled. This is called surprise. Get it? It's called you have arrived, chop. Okay, now, okay, this is called M3 because the money supply doubled again. It's not called M4, it's called M3. It takes many years to get this remembered. Okay? Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, let's take a look at 1943. In 1943, we have an $8,000 house. We've got an 8-cent loaf of bread. We've got a 12-cent dollar. We've got a 2% income tax. We've got M4. All right, we'll try another one. Okay, 1953 rolls along. You won't guess what happens in 1953, or maybe you will. $16,000 house, 16-cent loaf of bread, 6-cent dollar, 4% income tax, M5. Moving right along, we now come to 1963. It takes a little while to understand history. All right, $32,000 for a house, 32 cents for a loaf of bread, 3 cents for a dollar, 8% income tax, M6. I'm going to show you what happens at M10. Okay? At M10, something magical happens. And I'll explain that in just a minute. Okay, 1973, we have a $64,000 house, a 64-cent loaf of bread, a dollar worth 2 cents, and a 16% income tax. We have M7. Moving right along, we come to 1983. We have a $128,000 house. We've got a $1.28 loaf of bread. We've got a dollar worth 1 cent. It takes 100 times more today to buy something than your grandfather paid in 1913. Plus, you're going to lose 32% in the taxes, which he didn't. You understand how why Grandpa had the farm and you don't, right? I mean, this is understandable? Okay, he was much better off. Okay, M8. Okay, moving right along, we come to 1993. And since this is going to be on a videotape, we won't tell you what year this is. We'll just keep going. Because, see, it really doesn't matter. This thing will be just as correct 20 years from now as it was today. Okay? We've got, oh golly, 128, what do we got there? $256,000 for a house, a $2.56 loaf of bread, a dollar worth 1/2 of 1 cent, and a 64% income tax, and we have M9. Isn't this exciting? All right, moving along to M10. We have the year 2003, $512,000 for a house, $5.12 for a loaf of bread, a dollar worth 1/10 of 1 cent, and a 128% income tax, and M10. We have arrived. How would you pay 128% income tax? And I'll give you the answer. You'd have to sell everything you own and borrow money. And you would say, well, who would do that? And I would tell you right now, American farmers all do that. Isn't that interesting? Anybody who has property does that. Because the property, the ownership of the property is a burden. Okay? All right. The ownership of anything is a burden. Okay, what happened here? Why? What happened? Let's take a look. Let's go back to 1776. We go back to 1776, and the average house was $1,000. And again, we're going to give you some books and documentation. The loaf of bread was a penny. Okay, the dollar was $1. The income tax was 0. Okay, and we still had M1. Okay, now 137 years go by. Okay, all these years go by, and what do we have? Why, we have no inflation, do we? Now, what do we hear when we go to school? Why, inflation has always been with us. Inflation is a perennial problem. Whoops, not for America. Not for the first 137 years, was it? And we've always had taxes. Well, not for the first 130 years. We didn't have these taxes. By the way, you know, Will Rogers says there is a difference between death and taxes. Did you know that? He said that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Okay, but anyway, so what we have here, you see, is that, okay, is you see that basically we have 137 years here where there wasn't any income tax or any inflation. Isn't that interesting? We didn't hear this in school, did we? We didn't hear that there was a big difference between 1776 to 1913 and 1913. We didn't hear this in economics. We didn't get this in history, did we? A few things kind of left out of the school system, isn't it, see? Well, suppose I went to school and I taught this. How long do you think I'd be on the faculty, see? See, not very long. Probably till about the college president heard I was teaching something like this, because this is not to be taught on a college campus, because this does not produce adjustment, you see. And that's what they're after with the kiddies, is adjustment. Isn't this interesting? It's not necessary that Johnny learns to read, write, or spell. It's necessary that he's adjusted. We have now just discussed higher learning. See? Actually, higher learning is dangerous, so you don't get any of it. You just get more years in school. It's devoid of higher learning, isn't it? All right? Because you'd be all upset if you learned something happened in 1913 that wasn't going on before, wouldn't you? And that wouldn't produce adjustment, you see. So therefore, the government must run all the schools to make sure that this adjustment is induced. All right, let's take a look at this.